On the edge of a wide, dusty plain, under the endless sky, there was a lonely ranch nestled among the hills. This place was home to a man who didn't need much beyond his cattle, his horses, and the quiet solitude of the land. His name was Jacob Hawthorne, a grizzled rancher in his late 40s. His life had been full of hard work, loss, and silence. He didn't ask for much, but he gave everything he had to the land that was now his only companion. The smell of the fresh air, the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass, and the deep, clear sky above made him feel like he belonged to the earth itself. Jacob's wife had passed years ago, and his children had moved east to find their own path. He rarely saw other folks except for a few neighbors who kept to their own business, just as he kept to his. This way of life suited him, quiet, unbothered. He never had much use for towns or the gossip they carried. Yet even though he preferred to stay out of the way, he was no stranger to the struggles of the frontier. One day, as Jacob was out on his horse checking on his cattle as he did most afternoons, he noticed something strange in the distance. The wind was strong that day and the sky was a deep sunburnt red, but there was something about the way the air felt, tense, heavy. His horse, a sturdy gelding named Blaze, was skittish as they approached the source of unease. There on the horizon he saw it, 7 figures hanging from the low branches of a large leafless tree. At first Jacob thought his eyes were deceiving him. He pulled on the reins and urged Blaze forward. As they got closer, the figures became clearer. They were bodies, 7 women hanging by their necks, their faces pale, their bodies lifeless. A sickening knot twisted in Jacob's stomach. The brutality of it was beyond anything he could understand. The rancher's heart raced as he dismounted from his horse. The heat of the day seemed to stifle the air around him. He stared at the hanged women, wondering what could have led to such a horrific act. His eyes moved from one body to the next, and then, just as his mind struggled to grasp the full horror of the scene, he noticed something. One of the women's chest was rising and falling ever so slightly. She was still alive. With sudden urgency, Jacob moved quickly toward the tree, cutting down the first of the bodies. One by one he lowered the lifeless women to the ground, until he reached the last one, the one who was barely holding on. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood, her body thin from malnutrition, but her chest rose with each labored breath. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. He wasn't sure if she was still conscious, but he had to act. He gently placed her on his horse, taking care to support her fragile body. He glanced back at the bodies of the others, knowing there was no time to bury them properly. The wind had picked up, the sky darkening as if it were mourning their fate. It was a long ride back to his ranch. The girl, now slumped against him on Blaze's back, had not said a word. Jacob's thoughts swirled with questions, but there was no one around to answer them. He had to get her to safety. He had to save her. When they finally arrived at the ranch, Jacob carried the girl into his small cabin. He had seen plenty of pain and suffering in his time, but something about the fragility of this girl shook him deeply. Her eyes flickered open briefly, locking onto his with a look of fear that cut through him like a blade. She was scared, and Jacob could see it. The fear wasn't just from the hanging. It was something deeper, something that made her distrust even the kindness he was trying to show. Jacob laid her down on a cot by the fire, stripping off her bloodied clothes and washing the cuts and bruises that marred her skin. She winced at his touch but didn't fight him. Her eyes never left his face, but she didn't speak. She was too weak, too broken. He felt a pang of guilt. He knew nothing about this girl or what she had been through, but he also knew he couldn't just let her die alone in the desert. As night fell, Jacob sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The girl rested, her breath shallow but steady. He couldn't stop thinking about what he had found. Why had they been hung like that? Why were they left to die? Jacob had heard stories, rumors about tensions between settlers and the Apache, but he never thought things had gotten this bad. He had lived out here for years, removed from the politics of the towns, but this felt like something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. At dawn, Jacob rose and checked on the girl. She was still alive, but barely. Her body was fighting to heal, but it was clear she had been through something far more than just physical pain. Jacob had seen that look in people's eyes before: desperation, hopelessness, the kind of terror that made them believe the world had no place for them. He couldn't help but feel responsible for her now. Something deep inside told him that saving her was just the beginning. There was something more at play here, something he had to uncover. The girl woke up, groggy and disoriented. Jacob offered her some water and she accepted it hesitantly. Her voice was weak when she spoke, but the words she whispered made Jacob's heart race. They were going to kill us all, she murmured, her eyes flickering with the remnants of fear. Jacob leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what she had just said. Who was going to kill you? He asked gently. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were afraid someone might overhear. The men who captured us. They want to finish what they started. The plan, it's bigger than you think. Jacob sat back in his chair, a chill creeping up his spine. He didn't know what she meant, but he could see the weight in her eyes. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. As the hours passed, the girl's strength returned little by little. She told him her name, Shoshana, and Jacob learned that she was part of a small group of Apache women who had been captured by local settlers. They had been falsely accused of raiding a nearby farm, and the men who had captured them had no intention of taking them to trial. They had planned to hang them all as a message to the Apache tribe. Shoshana's survival had been nothing short of a miracle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Shoshana revealed next. The massacre was just the beginning of a much larger plot to wipe out the Apache. Powerful men in town had plans to lead a full-scale raid on the Apache camps, slaughtering anyone they could find. They were using the execution of the women as a cover for their real goal: genocide. Jacob listened in stunned silence. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. This wasn't just an act of violence. It was a calculated, cold plan to destroy an entire people. He didn't know how he had gotten mixed up in this, but now that he was, he couldn't turn his back. He had to stop it before it was too late. Jacob sat in the silence of his cabin, thinking over everything Shoshana had told him. The weight of her words pressed down on him, and a storm of thoughts raged in his mind. He was a man of action, a man who had spent his life working the land and keeping to himself. But now he was being forced into something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The Apache, the settlers, the plot to wipe out an entire people. It all felt like a cruel twist of fate. He looked across the room at Shoshana, who was resting by the fire. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but there was a fire in her that Jacob admired. She was determined to survive, to warn her people, and to stop the men behind this terrible plot. But she couldn't do it alone, and neither could Jacob. After a long night of thinking, Jacob decided that he couldn't just sit by. The world had never been kind to the Apache, but that didn't mean he had to turn his back on them. He had spent too many years as a bystander to the suffering of others. Now he was going to take a stand. The next morning, Jacob saddled his horse and prepared to leave. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he knew he needed to act quickly. The massacre wasn't just a rumor. It was a real dangerous plan, and the people behind it were close to executing it. If he didn't act fast, more lives would be lost. Shoshana, though still weak, insisted on coming with him. "I have to warn my people," she said, her voice shaky but full of determination. Jacob didn't argue. She was right. He couldn't do this without her. The two of them rode out into the rugged wilderness. The sun was high in the sky and the air was dry, but the journey ahead was anything but easy. The land was unforgiving, and every step felt like it was leading them deeper into a world of danger. Jacob wasn't sure who he could trust, but one thing was clear: time was running out. They traveled for days, avoiding the main roads and sticking to the rough trails that Jacob knew so well. Along the way, Shoshana told Jacob more about the people who were plotting against her people. The men behind the plan were wealthy and powerful, men who controlled the town and its resources. They had no concern for the lives of the Apache or anyone else who didn't serve their interests. They were driven by greed, and their hearts were as cold as the desert winds. As they approached the town, Jacob felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had always kept to himself, but now he was going to have to face the people who had been behind the plot. The thought of confronting them filled him with unease, but he knew it had to be done. The Apache weren't the only ones who needed to be saved. His own conscience wouldn't allow him to turn away from this. They found an old, run-down saloon on the edge of the town, a place where the desperate and the dangerous gathered. Jacob and Shoshana slipped inside, trying to remain unnoticed. The air inside was thick with smoke, and the noise of drunken laughter filled the room. Jacob kept his head down, scanning the crowd for any signs of the men they needed to find. It didn't take long for them to spot one of the conspirators, a tall, Sharp-faced man sitting at a corner table, speaking in low tones to a group of local ranchers. Jacob's gut tightened as he recognized him. This was one of the men Shoshana had warned him about. His name was Tom McAllister, a man known for his ruthless ways and his control over the local law. Jacob motioned for Shoshana to stay behind him as they quietly moved closer. He needed to hear more of their conversation before making a move. "It's almost time," McAllister was saying, his voice low but urgent. "The Apache have been cornered. We'll ride in at dawn. The town will be safe from their raids forever." Jacob felt his blood run cold. They were planning to strike at first light. This wasn't just a simple attack, it was a massacre, and the lives of countless people would be lost if McAllister and his men got their way. Shoshana's grip on Jacob's arm tightened as she listened, her face pale with fear and fury. She knew her people wouldn't stand a chance if they were attacked, but Jacob was already thinking ahead. He couldn't let them carry out their plan, not after everything he had learned. He waited until McAllister stood to leave the table before he acted. In a flash, Jacob grabbed the man by the arm, spinning him around. "You're not going anywhere," Jacob growled, his voice low but filled with determination. McAllister's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, sneering. "What's this, Hawthorne? You think you can stop me?" "I know exactly what you're planning," Jacob said, his grip tightening. "And it's not going to happen." McAllister's face twisted into a scowl. "You have no idea what you're getting into, old man. The Apache will be gone, and this land will belong to us." Shoshana stepped forward, her voice shaking but strong. "You're wrong. You won't take our lives. Not without a fight." Jacob's hand reached for his rifle, but before he could act, a loud crash echoed through the saloon. The door slammed open and a group of men entered, all of them wearing the same grim expression. These were McAllister's men, the same ones who had been behind the plot. They were armed and ready for violence. Jacob's heart raced. There was no more time to waste. He had to act now. Without thinking, he pulled Shoshana behind him and rushed toward the back door. The men in the saloon shouted and gave chase, but Jacob was faster. They had to get out before they were surrounded. Outside, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the desert. Jacob and Shoshana ran, their breaths coming in quick gasps as they pushed forward, trying to put as much distance between them and the men in the saloon. But Jacob knew they wouldn't be safe for long. The confrontation had only just begun. As they reached the edge of the town, Jacob turned to Shoshana, his eyes determined. "We're going to stop them, but we can't do it alone. We need to gather help." Shoshana nodded, her fear replaced by a fierce resolve. "I'll stand by you," she said. "I won't let them destroy my people." And with that, they rode off into the night, ready to face whatever lay ahead.